My name is Evelyn Harper, and the moment the church bells faded, I realized my own children no longer saw me as their mother. They saw me as something they needed to manage, move around, and quietly endure. I was sitting on the old wooden bench along the church porch, the same bench I'd sat on for decades, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The bell rope inside was still swaying, and the sound had barely finished echoing across the fields when the words came out of my mouth. I didn't plan them. I didn't rehearse them. They rose up the way truth does when you've been holding it down for too long. "Why do you call me Mom?" I asked, my voice steady, but treat me like a burden. No one answered right away. My oldest daughter looked at the floor. My son cleared his throat. And for a split second, I thought I'd gone too far. Not because the question was cruel, but because it was honest. That moment didn't come out of nowhere. It was the end of something that had been building for years. I grew up in a small Indiana town where church wasn't just a place you went, it was where life happened. Weddings, funerals, potlucks, Christmas pageants. I married my husband Robert in that very church when I was 22. We raised 3 children in a modest white house 5 minutes away, and every Sunday, without fail, we sat in the same pew. Robert worked at the factory. I worked wherever I could, grocery store, school, cafeteria, later, as a receptionist, always part-time, always flexible, because someone had to be home when the kids got sick, or the bus was late. I never thought of it as sacrifice back then. It was just what you did. When Robert died 12 years ago, life didn't shatter all at once. It thinned out like fabric worn too often. The house got quieter. The days stretched longer. At first, the kids called every week, then every couple of weeks, then mostly when something needed to be discussed. "Mom, we're thinking about selling the house." "Mom, it might be easier if you stayed with us for a while." "Mom, you don't really need all that space anymore." They said those things gently, the way people do when they believe kindness cancels out control. I moved in with my daughter first. Just temporarily. That's what she said. I slept in the guest room and folded my blankets every morning so no one would think I was settling in too comfortably. I cooked dinner when I could, stayed quiet when I couldn't, and learned the strange feeling of being a guest in someone else's home while still being their mother. Little things started to change. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Plans were made without asking me. Once, when I offered to help with the bills, my son-in-law smiled politely and said, "Don't worry about that, Evelyn. We've got it handled." The way he said my name, not Mom, not Grandma, told me exactly where I stood. After a year, my daughter suggested I stay with my son for a bit, just to give everyone some breathing room, she said. I nodded because nodding was easier than asking what I'd done wrong. At my son's house, I tried harder. I stayed out of the way. I watched television with the volume low. I asked before using the washing machine. But no matter how small I made myself, I could feel it, that unspoken weight. That sense that my presence complicated things. One afternoon, I overheard my son on the phone. He didn't know I was home. "I love her," he said quietly, "but it's just a lot. We didn't plan for this." That was the day I stopped pretending. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dresser that wasn't mine, holding a life that no longer felt like my own. That night, I made a decision. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, just a clear one. I was done apologizing for being alive. I called my lawyer the next week, a man I'd known for years through church and town meetings. He didn't look surprised when I asked about updating my will, my power of attorney, and my medical directives. He asked me one question that stayed with me. "Evelyn," he said gently, "what do you want the rest of your life to look like?" No one had asked me that in a long time. I didn't tell the children about those changes. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because for the first time, I needed something to be mine. My choices, my voice, my dignity. And that's how I found myself back on that church porch months later, sitting in the autumn light, my children beside me, the bells still echoing in the air. I hadn't invited them there to accuse them. I hadn't come to embarrass them. I came because churches are honest places. Because truth sounds different when spoken under a roof built for reflection. "Why do you call me Mom?" I asked again, softer this time, but treat me like a burden. I wasn't angry. I was tired. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would happen if I said so. Life didn't suddenly become unkind after that day on the church porch. In many ways, it had always been moving in this direction. What changed was that I finally allowed myself to look back and see how long I'd been walking it. When I think about my life before all this, I don't remember grand moments. I remember ordinary ones, packing lunches at dawn, sewing buttons back onto coats, standing in grocery store aisles with a calculator because every dollar mattered. That was the rhythm of my days, quiet, repetitive, and full of purpose. Robert and I didn't have much when we started out. Our first house had creaky floors and a furnace that groaned every winter, but it was ours. We learned early that love wasn't about comfort, it was about consistency. He worked long shifts, sometimes nights, and I built my life around keeping everything else running. The children grew up knowing dinner would be on the table, that someone would be waiting when they got home, that the lights would stay on, even if it meant I picked up another shift. I didn't keep score back then. Mothers rarely do. When the kids were young, they needed me constantly. Then came the teenage years when they pretended they didn't. After that, adulthood arrived, and with it, the belief that independence meant distance. I understood that. Or at least I told myself I did. That's what good mothers do, they make room for their children to leave. What I didn't expect was how invisible I would become once they did. After Robert passed, I kept busy at first. I volunteered at the church office, helped organize meal trains, folded bulletins on Thursdays. People praised my strength. They told me I was handling it well. But grief doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up in empty chairs and silent evenings, in the way you stop setting 2 cups on the counter without realizing it. The children visited when they could, holidays mostly. I told myself that was enough. It wasn't until my health scare, a minor one really, that everything shifted. A fall in the kitchen, a night in the hospital for observation. Suddenly, there were meetings. Conversations I wasn't fully part of. Decisions made in soft voices outside my room. She shouldn't be alone anymore. It's just safer this way. She'll understand. I understood more than they realized. Moving out of my home felt like shedding skin. Every box I packed held a piece of myself, old photos, letters, the recipe cards I'd handwritten over decades. I asked if I could keep the piano. My daughter hesitated, then said there wasn't space. I nodded and let it go, along with so many other things. Living with my children wasn't cruel. It was just uncomfortable in a way no one wanted to name. I was loved, but not needed. Included, but not consulted. I existed in the margins of their lives, careful not to take up too much room. The word burden was never spoken out loud. It didn't need to be. It showed up in sighs when I asked questions, in the way conversations stopped when money came up, in the gentle reminders that appointments had already been scheduled without me. I started to second-guess myself constantly. Was I asking too much? Talking too long? Wanting too much? I learned how to shrink. I told myself this was the price of aging. That dignity meant silence. That complaining would only confirm what they already felt. But something inside me resisted. A quiet voice that said, "You didn't raise them to forget you." That voice grew louder the more invisible I became. At night, I lay awake thinking about the woman I used to be, the one who made decisions, who carried responsibility without apology. I remembered the years when people depended on me without question. Somewhere along the way, that version of me had been packed away like an old coat, useful once, now inconvenient. I began to realize that love, when unspoken, can turn into neglect without anyone noticing. That's when I started preparing, not out of spite, out of clarity. I met with my lawyer again, reviewed documents I hadn't looked at in years, made sure my wishes were written clearly, not vaguely. I thought about medical decisions, about finances, about where I wanted to live, if I could no longer manage on my own. I didn't do this to punish my children. I did it because I finally understood something important. Waiting to be valued is a dangerous way to live. I also started attending a small support group at the church. Other widows, other women who had given everything and found themselves unsure of their place afterward. We didn't complain. We shared. And in sharing, I realized how common my story was. That knowledge didn't make it easier, but it made it real. By the time I sat on that church porch with my children beside me, I wasn't asking my question out of confusion anymore. I was asking it because I had earned the right to be heard. I wasn't looking for apologies. I was looking for recognition. And deep down, I knew something else too. Once a truth is spoken aloud, it doesn't disappear. It waits to be answered. There was a time when being called mom felt like the most natural thing in the world. It meant scraped knees and late-night phone calls, school permission slips, and Sunday dinners. Somewhere along the way, that word changed. It stayed the same on the surface, but underneath it picked up a different meaning: obligation instead of affection, responsibility instead of connection. I didn't notice the exact moment it happened. Most changes like that don't arrive with announcements. They slip in quietly, disguised as practicality. After moving between my children's homes, I began to understand patterns. I was welcome when I was convenient, when I fit neatly into schedules, into spare rooms, into carefully measured patience. I was less welcome when I had needs of my own. It started with small things. Mom, we already ate. Mom, we're running late. Mom, can we talk about this another time? Another time rarely came. I learned to ask questions carefully, to phrase everything as a suggestion, to preface my thoughts with apologies even when I hadn't done anything wrong. I might be mistaken, I'd say. Or, this probably isn't important. I didn't recognize myself anymore, the woman who once made firm decisions, who ran a household with confidence. What hurt most wasn't the lack of attention. It was the assumption that I would understand. When my daughter decided to renovate her kitchen, I found out after the fact. When my son took a new job across state lines, no one asked how that might affect me. Plans were discussed around me, not with me. I was included the way furniture is included, present, but not consulted. The word burden lived in the air between us. It was never spoken, but it was felt. One afternoon, my daughter sat me down at the dining table. Her voice was gentle, rehearsed. Mom, we've been thinking, she said. Long term. That phrase, long term, sounded like a verdict. She explained that juggling work, kids, and me was becoming a lot. That they loved me, of course, but they needed balance. She suggested assisted living. Not immediately, she said. Just something to consider. I nodded. I smiled. I thanked her for her honesty. Inside, something cracked. Assisted living wasn't the issue. It was the way the conversation framed me, not as a person with preferences, but as a problem to solve. A responsibility to be managed efficiently. Later that week, I overheard my son speaking to his wife. She doesn't mean to, he said. But it's like having another child. That sentence followed me for days. I began to notice how often my presence was measured. How often I was discussed in terms of logistics instead of love. Who would drive me? Who would pay? Who would handle things? I realized then that calling someone mom doesn't guarantee respect. It can become a label stripped of meaning, used out of habit rather than care. The loneliness surprised me. Not because I was alone, but because I wasn't. Being surrounded by people who see you as an inconvenience is a special kind of isolation. I stopped sharing my thoughts, stopped mentioning aches and pains, stopped talking about memories. I didn't want to remind them that I was still here, still taking up space. I watched myself fade into the background of their lives, a quiet presence they tolerated, but didn't truly engage with. And yet they still called me mom. That contradiction sat heavy in my chest. I thought about my own mother, how fiercely she held on to her independence, how she refused to be tucked away neatly. I'd promised myself I wouldn't become bitter, wouldn't demand attention. But silence, I learned, doesn't always earn peace. Sometimes it just confirms invisibility. One evening, after another polite but distant family dinner, I went for a walk alone. The air was cool, the sky stretched wide and forgiving. For the first time in months, I let myself feel angry. Not explosive anger, something steadier, something clarifying. I wasn't angry that my children had lives of their own. I was angry that my life had been reduced to an inconvenience in theirs. That night, I wrote everything down. Not a letter to them, a letter to myself. I wrote about who I had been, what I had given, what I still deserved. I wrote without censoring myself, without softening the truth. And when I finished, I understood something I hadn't before. Being a mother doesn't mean surrendering your identity forever. The next morning, I began making quiet changes. I reclaimed small choices. I asked direct questions. I stopped apologizing for existing. The shift was subtle, but it mattered. Because when you are treated like a burden long enough, the greatest act of defiance is remembering your worth. Part 3. When mom became a problem. 1 was 3 words. I didn't announce the changes I was making. I didn't feel the need to. For most of my life, I had explained myself endlessly why dinner was late, why money was tight, why certain decisions had to be made. Quietly, I realized I didn't owe anyone an explanation for choosing myself. The decision didn't come all at once. It settled in slowly, like a truth that had been waiting for me to catch up. I started by finding my own rhythm again. I woke earlier than everyone else, sat by the window with my coffee, and let the house stay silent for a while. I stopped rushing through my mornings. I dressed for myself, not for convenience. These were small acts, but they felt like reclaiming pieces of ground I hadn't known I'd lost. I also stopped asking permission for things I had every right to decide. When I needed to rest, I rested. When I wanted to attend church activities, I went, even if it meant arranging my own transportation. I began keeping my calendar private. For the first time in years, my time belonged to me. The larger decision came after another visit to the doctor. Nothing dramatic, just the steady accumulation of reminders that I was aging. Sitting in that exam room, I realized how easily my voice could be erased if I wasn't careful. Forms, checkboxes, signatures, all of it mattered more than I had ever understood. That afternoon, I called my lawyer again. We met in his office a week later, sunlight slanting across the worn carpet. He asked careful questions and listened without interrupting. I told him exactly what I wanted: clarity, autonomy, a future where my wishes would be honored even if my voice grew tired. We updated everything: my will, my medical directives, my power of attorney. I chose who would speak for me and under what circumstances. I made decisions based on who respected me, not who shared my last name. When I walked out of that office, I felt lighter. Not relieved, resolved. I also began looking into housing options. Not the kind my children had suggested, but ones I chose myself. Places where independence wasn't something you surrendered at the door. I toured a small senior community not far from the church. Modest apartments, a shared garden. People who greeted me by name, not obligation. For the first time in a long while, I imagined a future that didn't revolve around fitting into someone else's life. I didn't tell my children right away. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I needed to know what these decisions meant to me before they became a conversation. I wanted them to come from strength, not defensiveness. The change happened quietly, but they felt it. I stopped hovering, stopped anticipating their needs. When conversations turned to logistics about me, I spoke up. I've already handled that, I would say calmly. The surprise on their faces told me how little they were used to hearing that. At first, they were confused, then mildly irritated. My independence disrupted their plans. It forced them to adjust. I watched carefully how they reacted. Some responded with curiosity, others with resistance. Control. I learned often hides behind concern. One evening, my daughter asked, "Why didn't you tell us you were doing all this?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because I said for once I needed to listen to myself. The room went quiet, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. That silence mattered. I also began writing again. Not letters, not accusations, reflections, memories, lessons I wished I'd understood sooner. I didn't know if I'd ever share them. The act of writing itself felt grounding, like leaving a record of who I was beyond the roles I'd filled. As the weeks passed, something shifted. My children spoke to me differently, more carefully, less assumptively. Not because they suddenly understood everything, but because the ground beneath them had changed. I was no longer waiting to be placed. The church remained my anchor. Sunday mornings, familiar hymns, familiar faces. People who remembered me as Evelyn, not a problem to solve. Sitting in the pew, I felt whole in a way I hadn't in years. I knew the conversation on the church porch had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. The question I asked still hung in the air, unanswered. But I wasn't afraid of that anymore. Because I had made my decision. Whatever came next, it would be on my terms. The truth has a way of surfacing when people least expect it. Not with shouting or confrontation, but through paperwork timing and consequences no one planned for. The moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. I wasn't feeling well that morning. Not alarmingly so, just tired in a way that didn't lift. My chest felt heavy, my legs unsteady. I told my daughter I needed to see my doctor. She insisted on coming along. In the waiting room, she scrolled through her phone while I filled out forms I'd already completed once before. This time, though, I noticed something different. At the top of the intake paperwork was a line that read, "Emergency contact and medical decision maker." My daughter reached for the clipboard automatically. "I'll fill that part in," she said. I gently pulled it back. "I've already taken care of it," I replied. She looked at me confused. "What do you mean?" I said evenly, those decisions are already documented. The doctor came in shortly after, followed by a nurse carrying a folder thicker than usual. As they reviewed my chart, something shifted in the room. The nurse paused, looked up, then back down again. "Mrs. Harper," she said, "I see you've updated your medical directives." "Yes," I answered. She nodded and turned to my daughter. "Just so you're aware, you're not listed as the primary decision maker." The silence that followed was sharp. My daughter's face changed, not angry, not sad, startled, as if a door she assumed was always open had quietly closed. Later that afternoon, my son called. Word travels fast in families when expectations are challenged. "Mom," he said carefully, "is everything okay?" "It is," I replied. "Then why are we hearing about changes from other people?" I took a breath, because they were my changes to make. There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear him recalculating, trying to understand a version of me he hadn't accounted for. The next Sunday after service, we met on the church porch again. Not planned, not staged, just inevitable. They came with questions, with concern that sounded suspiciously like control. "We just want to understand," my son said. "We're trying to help," my daughter added. "I know," I said, "but helping doesn't mean deciding for me." That's when the other truth surfaced. My lawyer had sent copies of updated documents to the appropriate places, including a financial institution my son had assumed he would manage when the time came. When he discovered his name wasn't where he expected it to be, something cracked open. "You don't trust us?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "This isn't about trust," I said. "It's about respect." That word hung between us heavier than anything else. I explained calmly. No accusations, no raised voices. I told them how it felt to be discussed instead of consulted. How being called mom while being treated like a responsibility erodes something fundamental. How silence had been mistaken for consent. My daughter began to cry then. Not dramatically, quietly. The way people cry when they realize something too late. "We didn't know you felt this way," she said. "I tried to tell you," I replied softly, but I didn't have the words yet. The conversation didn't fix everything. That's not how real life works. But it changed the balance. For the first time, they weren't managing me. They were listening. My son admitted something that surprised me. I think he said slowly, "We thought we were doing what was best. And maybe we forgot to ask what you wanted." That admission mattered more than any apology. Over the next few weeks, things shifted. I moved into the senior community I'd chosen, not because I was pushed, but because I wanted to. They helped me pack this time, asking before touching my things. When I played the piano in the common room, my first night there, I felt something settle inside me. I wasn't being placed anymore. I was choosing. The truth had surfaced, and with it came consequences, not punishment, but clarity. My children were forced to see me not as a role, not as a problem, but as a person with agency. And I was finally seen. The weeks that followed were quieter. Not tense, not awkward, just careful. As if we were all learning how to walk on new ground without breaking it. My children visited the senior community for the first time on a Sunday afternoon. They brought coffee pastries from a local bakery and a kind of politeness that felt unfamiliar. They asked, before sitting, before opening cabinets, before making suggestions. It struck me how small gestures can reveal big changes. We sat in the common room near the window. Sunlight spilled across the floor, and outside a few residents tended to the garden. No one rushed the conversation. No one checked their phone. For once, time wasn't being managed. I didn't realize my daughter began, then stopped. She took a breath. "I didn't realize how much we decided for you without noticing." I nodded. Most people don't. It happened slowly. My son leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I think we were scared," he admitted. "Scared of losing you. Scared of doing something wrong. And somehow, that turned into trying to control everything." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy he used to be. The one who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares. The one who once asked me if I'd still be his mom when he grew up. "I understand fear," I said gently. "But fear doesn't give anyone the right to erase another person's voice." No one argued with that. We talked for a long time that afternoon. About Robert. About the years after his death. About how silence had filled the spaces where conversation should have been. I told them how lonely it felt to be loved in theory, but overlooked in practice. "I didn't want to burden you," I said, "but I also didn't want to disappear." My daughter reached for my hand. Not out of guilt, out of recognition. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Not just for what we did, for what we didn't see." That apology didn't erase the past, but it softened it. In the days that followed, They called more often. Not to check in, not to manage, just to talk. We spoke about ordinary things. The weather, the neighbors, the way life has a habit of changing before you're ready. I noticed something else too. They started asking questions. Real ones. What do you want, Mom? How do you feel about this? Does this work for you? Those questions mattered. One afternoon, I returned to the church alone. I sat on the same porch where the question had been asked weeks earlier. The bench felt different now. Lighter. Not because the story had ended, but because it had been told. The pastor came out and sat beside me. He didn't ask why I was there. He just sat. Truth has a way of settling, he said eventually. Yes, I replied, if you let it. That evening, I wrote again. This time, not from anger or frustration, but from clarity. I wrote about boundaries, about how love doesn't mean surrender, about how aging doesn't mean becoming invisible. I knew my children were trying. I also knew reconciliation isn't a single conversation, it's a practice. And for the first time in a long while, I believed we were practicing together. The church bells sounded different that morning. Not louder, not softer. Just different, as if I was hearing them with ears that finally understood what they were calling me back to. I arrived early and sat alone in the pew where Robert and I had spent so many Sundays. The wood was worn smooth by decades of hands and prayers. I ran my fingers along the edge and smiled at the thought of how much life had passed through this place without ever asking permission. That felt familiar. When my children arrived, they didn't sit beside me right away. They paused first, looked, then asked, "Is this okay?" It was a small question, but it carried weight. "Yes," I said, "it is." The service passed quietly. Hymns I'd sung for years took on new meaning. Words about dignity, humility, and love felt less like ideals and more like instructions I could finally follow without disappearing inside them. Afterward, we walked out together onto the porch. The same porch, the same bench. This time, no one waited for me to speak. No one filled the air with explanations or defenses. We stood there, letting the moment breathe. "I've been thinking about your question," my son said finally. I nodded. "So have I." He took a breath. "I don't think we meant to treat you like a burden. But I can see now that intention doesn't change impact." That sentence mattered more than anything else he could have said. My daughter added, "We were so busy trying to be good children that we forgot how to be present ones." I looked at them, really looked, and saw not guilt, but growth. And that was something I could work with. I don't need perfection, I told them. I need honesty. I need respect. And I need room to still be myself. They both nodded. That was enough. Revenge isn't always loud. It isn't slammed doors, or raised voices, or dramatic exits. Sometimes revenge is refusing to vanish. Sometimes it's choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing others. I didn't take anything from my children. In the months that followed, our relationship settled into something steadier. Not the same as before, better. We learned how to talk again, how to listen without fixing, how to disagree without erasing one another. They stopped managing me. I stopped shrinking. I stayed in my apartment at the senior community, surrounded by people who knew my name without attaching expectations to it. I volunteered. I played the piano on Wednesday afternoons. I cooked meals for myself without apologizing for the mess or the time it took. And every so often my children came to visit, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. I knew not every story ends this way. Some questions are never answered. Some families never listen. But I also knew this much to be true. Silence teaches people how to treat you. And so does speaking up. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you've ever felt reduced to a role instead of recognized as a person? I want you to hear this clearly. You are not a burden. You are not an inconvenience. You do not lose your worth with age. Boundaries are not betrayal. Clarity is not cruelty. And choosing yourself does not mean you love your family any less. Sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is remind the world and her children that she is still here. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to reflect on the conversations you've been avoiding. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about dignity, truth, and reconciliation, consider staying with us for the next one. Because no one should ever feel like a burden for surviving the life they gave everything to.